Russian opposition leader Alexey Navalny sentenced to jail in a move that's criticized by Western nations. How will his arrest impact U.S. Russia relations? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Russian court sentenced Alexey Navalny to a little over 2.5 years in jail for violating probation following a 2014 embezzlement case. Navalny just returned to Russia from Germany, where he spent the last 6 months recovering from an assassination attempt by poisoning. He accuses the Russian government of trying to kill him, a claim the Kremlin denies. Thousands of Russians have taken to the streets to demand his release. Stuart Smith has details from Moscow.
This all dates back to a court case beginning in 2014 on fraud charges, which Alexey Navalny says are politically motivated. He received a suspended sentence. Then last year, he was poisoned while campaigning in Siberia. He fell into a coma. He was flown to Berlin for treatment, and he made a miraculous recovery. But Russia's prison service said he violated his probation by leaving the country, and on top of that, had regularly violated public order. So they asked the court to upgrade the suspended sentence to real jail time, and the judge agreed. He'll now be sent to a labor camp for 2 years and 8 months. Before receiving the verdict, Navalny made an impassioned speech from the courtroom, calling President Putin Vladimir the underwear poisoner, a reference to traces of a nerve agent being found in Navalny's underwear by European labs, and his claim that the Russian state tried to kill him. The Kremlin denies any part in his illness. Stuart Smith, CGTN, Moscow.
There's lots to talk about. Let's get to our panel, all joining us via Skype. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer is a defense analyst and a columnist for the Novaya Gazeta. Vladimir Golstein heads the Slavic Studies department at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. From Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, Sean Guillory is a digital scholarship curator for the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And Harlan Ullman here in Washington, D.C. is the chairman of the Killowen group. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Let us start in Moscow with Pavel Felgenhauer. And Pavel, the arrest of Alexey Navalny and the trial has led to widespread demonstrations in Russia. We've seen thousands of people take to the streets. What is your assessment of the kind of support he has in Russia? And do these demonstrations and the turnout surprise you? Because there was a recent poll that was done that showed that only 2% of Russians would vote for him if he were to run for president.
No, he's not running for president, and so these figures are not really that relevant. Of course, the official line of the Kremlin is that this is a very small group of discontented people organized by Navalny, that the mass of the Russian people does not support him. Well, the last time Navalny actually ran for office for mayor of Moscow, in 2013, he got 27% of the vote in Moscow, though at on a low turnout. So he has support. He's now, of course, the undisputed leader of those who don't like the present government and don't like President Vladimir Putin. But right now, of course, it's not that Russia is on the verge of regime change. That is not true. But there's a lot of discontent, and it's growing. The economic situation has been that Russia has been stagnating economically for almost 10 years. And right now, with the pandemic, things have gotten worse. Households are suffering. And there's a lot of anger and discontent within the population that could, in any moment, find a way out and express itself in support for a radical opposition figure. So that is also possible.
Sean, Alexey Navalny returned to Russia from Germany, where he underwent treatment for poisoning. He called for demonstrations. He also released an almost 2-hour documentary which detailed what he says is evidence of corruption in Russia led by President Putin. And as I said, we've seen thousands of people take to the streets after he was put on trial. Some in the West call this a show trial. But do you think that the President Vladimir Putin, has underestimated Navalny's popularity?
Well, the question of Navalny's popularity is an interesting one, and to like go upon what Pavel said, I think Navalny functions as a cipher. He functions as something where people can express their frustrations, and I think Putin's government has greatly underestimated the level of discontent in society, or the growing level of discontent in society, and it kind of reveals to me a disconnect between whatever is going on in the presidential administration, whatever Putin's advisors are telling him about the mood of the country, and really it shows the Russian government's inability, or for lack of a better term, reluctance to do anything substantive to address some of the social issues that Pavel has pointed to. And I think this is one of the reasons why Navalny's video about Putin resonated so much. First, Navalny has shied away from attacking Putin directly, and this was a wonderfully orchestrated thing to do upon his return to Russia, releasing this video. And I think the contrast of the opulence of this Putin's palace really kind of desacralized Putin in many people's eyes, to basically show Putin he's no different than, say, I don't know, Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine in terms of the opulence of his wealth and lifestyle.
Vladimir Golstein, as Pavel told us just now, the Kremlin believes that the support for Alexey Navalny is very small. What is your reading of what is happening in the country right now?
Well, I think Kremlin has to deal with the situation. That is, to dismiss it by referring to numbers and by knowing that maybe only like 2 or 5% will vote for Navalny in some potential election. It doesn't mean anything. I agree with previous speakers that the situation, economic situation and so on, are exacerbated in Russia. Very unpopular move was done in 2018 about pensions and increasing the age when you get pension, and now we have pensioners who have to exist on about $150 a month, with prices going up, obviously, and so on. So maybe there is a miscalculation. The fact that somebody is not a threat politically doesn't mean that the country is very happy. So Navalny serves as a lightning rod by sort of by attracting a lot of people who are discontent, and I think probably parallel with maybe not exact parallel, but parallel with Trump might be very clear. That is not 70 million people are not enamored with Trump, but obviously they're not happy with the situation. They were not happy with the democratic policy, so they kind of moved there. So it's a task of a politician to address unrest, to address this unease. And I think so far Putin was not very successful at addressing the core issues of population discontent.
But Vladimir, do you think these demonstrations will escalate?
I think, I don't know what exactly it is, but there are two. I think problem is double. Putin is probably not the most successful in promoting his line, because clearly, when Navalny shows his videos about certain corrupt officials going all the way to Putin, they are well done. I from my experience of going to Russia, Putin does a fair amount of things for Russian economy, but obviously it's not enough, or maybe the issues are not addressed, or certain policies were misguided. I think his pension policy was not a correct one. So I think he probably has to address and explain what he's doing well, but also sort of to remedy certain mistakes, because discontent is there, and the best sign for that is this protests go all around the country, from Far East to kind of far West. It's not just limited to big cities.
May I add something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, one of the issues that the Putin government has is that it's finding itself in a position where it's not justifying its continued existence. If you contrast this from, say, the mid-2000s, where I think it did very well to promote the idea of prosperity, now in the fourth term of Putin, or he's having a hard, the government isn't justifying why this leadership should continue. It's not giving Russians much of an aspiration for the future. It keeps referring to the past. We won't go back to the 1990s. We won't go back to the destabilization of those times. But most Russians nowadays remember the mid-2000s. They remember the time where at least a sizable part of the population was living better than it ever had been before. And so this is the orientation that I think a lot of people are looking from.
Yeah, Sean, I want to get back to that in a moment, but first I want to go to Harlan. Harlan, the White House has responded to these developments in Russia. This is the White House Press Secretary, Jen Psaki. Let's listen.
Russia has international obligations to respect equality before the law and the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. We reiterate our call for the Russian government to immediately, unconditionally release Mr. Navalny.
And Harlan, there have also been calls for the release of Alexey Navalny from the United Kingdom, from Germany, and from France as well. Russia has said that this is interference in its domestic affairs. But what do you think is the best way for this new Biden administration to approach this?
The new Biden administration will be far more forward with civil liberties, civil rights, than obviously the Trump administration. Whether or not Vladimir Putin had any control over Donald Trump, clearly President Biden is going to approach the relationship far more professionally and far more directly. So they think the relationships between the two presidents will be much, much different. The area where cooperation is essential, and we've already seen first steps, is in arms control with the extension of New START. And I think the Biden administration will be pushing very, very hard in that direction. The Navalny thing is going to be a temporary issue, just like the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last May had its moments. This will pass. And I think one of the issues in Russia is Putin fatigue. You know, he's been around for a long time, and as the other panelists said, the Russian population is not very happy. What the new administration will do in Washington, it seems to me, is to move out far more in terms of areas of cooperation, climate change, obviously, arms control. And I think by embracing NATO and Europe much more closely, I think this will put in place more coherence and a stronger series of alliances with which Putin must deal. But as I said, this is Putin fatigue. I think Navalny is just a pip. This is not 1905, and I don't see any grounds for regime change. Who would replace Putin? Yeah. And as I said initially, the difference here with Biden is that Biden is going to take Mr. Putin on far more directly and frontally than Donald Trump ever did. Whether that will work or not remains to be seen.
Pavel, what's your view on that?
Well, it's fully understood in the Kremlin, of course, that if will be no economic growth, the regime is going to become increasingly wobbly. That's an understood thing. But how to achieve economic growth? I mean, the Kremlin and Putin personally were putting a lot of effort into trying to restart the economy. It's not responding. Then there's the pandemic. Then there's something else. The price of oil goes down. The Russian budget is in deficit. And there's an acute fight within different parts of the Kremlin administration and government for dwindling resources. And was one of the main kind of parties in this fight. There's the economic, financial part of the government that says that we should curtail spending, and especially defense spending. We should find a way to diffuse confrontation with the West, maybe find a way to decrease some kind of sanction relief, because without that, we're not going to have economic growth. And if we don't have economic growth, we'll have growing discontent, and it may end up in a total internal implosion, like in the Soviet Union in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And of course, the kind of so-called power people, the people from the defense ministry, from intelligence community, say that no, we cannot cut defense spending, and they are fighting that internal battle by promoting worse and worse relations with the United States. I mean, the confrontations may happen in the Black Sea. I mean, there can be actually direct shooting confrontations between American and Russian soldiers, or warplanes or something. because there are people in Russia who believe that more tension with the United States is a good idea because that will mean that their budgets will be intact.
Yeah. All right, I want to go to Sean. Sean, I want to get back to what we were talking about a moment ago when you said that the Putin government is having difficulty right now justifying its existence. There was an interesting piece in Al Jazeera recently on its website which reported that Russian society, according to this report, is divided into three unequal parts. Two minorities who are staunch supporters of either Navalny or Putin, and a majority third group who are more pragmatic and who do not necessarily want to see Putin ousted. Is that a fair assessment in your view?
I think it's a fair assessment, though I'll add one thing about the vast majority who doesn't necessarily want to see Putin ousted. Well, they also don't have a political alternative. I mean, this has been one of Putin's successes in the last 20 years, is to eliminate all potential legitimate alternatives to him. Let's, put aside street protests and people like Navalny, but even within the system itself, there isn't anyone who vies for any influence that's on par with Putin. And I think this is one of the problems of the ossification of the Putin political system, because at least, say, 10, 15 years ago, it allowed for some kind of measure of political pluralism, and all of those avenues have been mostly shut down since 2014.
Vladimir Golstein, what is your view on that? Is opposition to Putin policies, is that increasing?
I mean, there are a lot of people who are not happy, but I don't think they are united. I don't think they can present any strong kind of political voice and bring some kind of concrete leader. Furthermore, I would say that a lot depends. Russia always depended on foreign policy, on relationship with its neighbors, and so on. So I think West should be rather careful here. That is, I agree with your previous speaker. If the West decides, their priorities, climate, arms race, then it's fine. But if the Western leaders will continue to do what this Psaki just demonstrated, hectoring and lecturing Russians, they would actually. It will be the opposite effect. It will justify Putin. It will push people toward Putin.
Right.
It will say, again, we are under siege. So I think this moral lecturing, which the EU leaders and Americans will tend to do, is almost knee-jerk reaction of theirs to lecture Russia, to lecture China, to lecture other countries on moral behavior. It's misguided, and I think it would bring the opposite result of what everybody wants.
Vladimir, there is one difference in these current demonstrations we are seeing right now. In previous demonstrations, we've seen an educated group, middle-class liberals who have demonstrated against Putin, who wanted him to change his policies. But now we are seeing young people on the streets. We're seeing working-class people on the streets. What's the significance of that difference?
It is significant because, young people, basically, they're looking for the future, for secure future, for good jobs. And if this industry is not picking up, then their chances are grim. So they just basically, they're happy to protest. It could be Navalny, it could be some other kind of charismatic leader or anything. But, you basically have to give young people chances for the future to succeed, to do better than their parents. So this is very significant. But we have, both young people and probably old people, as I mentioned, pensioners. So I think, the situation is something which the Russian government has to address. But from what everybody kind of acknowledges and knows, that Putin's heart is more into foreign policy, and he somehow kind of is, he's okay, he's doing things domestically, but obviously not enough.
Harlan, Ullman. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You want to say?
There's an opportunity here, however. If you take a look at, as I said, Putin fatigue, if you recall in the final days of the Brezhnev administration, and Brezhnev was forever dying, you had geriatrics, which led to a series of leaders, which really led to the fall of the Soviet Union with Gorbachev coming into power. The situation is not the same, but as I said, Putin fatigue is very real, and it's in Putin's best interest to try to do something for the economy. Now, I think that President Biden has an opportunity here, and I'm not talking about a reset. If Russia will at least admit privately and cease and desist on the cyber warfare and espionage it's conducting, that may be grounds for a deal. Now, the deal would be over defense initially, not only arms control, but remember the conventional forces in Europe treaty the Russians withdrew from. And I think both the United States and Russia have strong economic reasons to reduce their defense spending mutually. So on that basis, I can see some kind of an arrangement in defense which would free up resources in the United States and Russia for the economic needs that both countries need and can de-escalate the situation. It can also lead to closer military-to-military ties to deconflict any potential tensions. The Black Sea was mentioned with overflights of American ships, warships that are using the Montreux Convention to be in the Black Sea. But to reduce these incidents where both sides are using military force to demonstrate to the other. Now, whether Biden will have the time to deal with this because his highest priorities are domestic, the economy, COVID, and all the problems we're having here with race, gender, and so forth, remains to be seen. But I do think that there's an opportunity. How quickly that opportunity can be seized, I don't know. But until it is, the tensions and hostilities between Russia and the United States are real. And don't forget, the United States also is worrying about China as well. So it's in its best interest to do what it can to try to relieve some of the tensions, both in Asia and the Pacific, as well as in Europe with Russia.
Sean, there may be no reset button, but would the Biden administration be looking at a carrot and stick approach? I mean, is the president under any kind of pressure here in the United States to show his... Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think Russia is gonna be high on the priorities of a Biden administration because it really does have its hands full. However, I think we should also consider past historical moments where a de-escalation with Russia, more cultural and people-to-people exchanges has impacted the domestic situation in Russia as well. It allows for some sort of thawing or cooling off of the domestic situation. So, I agree with one of the commenters earlier saying haranguing the Russians about their, domestic issues isn't going to really help the situation. In fact, I think it's going to work against the growing political forces in Russia because it's going to basically prove to the Kremlin what it already believes, and that is these are, machinations from the Americans, and this is what they want the Russian public to believe as well. So to have this as a Russian movement that doesn't have outsiders interfering is best. And plus, I think we should be honest that the United States really doesn't have that much power to do anything about Russia's domestic situation. So in many respects, these proclamations are kind of rote and expected, but they don't really, I don't think they really add to making things better.
Pavel, getting back to Alexey Navalny, there are those in Russia who have deep reservations about him, saying that he's an ultra-nationalist Russian. They point to some very controversial comments that he's made in the past about minorities in Russia. What do we know about that side of him?
Oh, yeah, he's a nationalist. I mean, in the way that he is Russian, absolutely, blue-eyed kind of guy. And yes, he kind of embraces. He's not kind of someone from the intelligentsia like Yavlinsky or someone else. He has no Jewish connections, which is also important. So he's a very strong potential candidate to be a real successor for Putin and his regime if there's going to be a collapse of the present regime and something's going to emerge, as it sometimes happens in Russia when the regime, a seemingly strong regime suddenly collapses and then someone gets the crown of the Russian Tsar out of the gutter. So Navalny can do that. He is very flexible. He is a natural political animal. I mean, I met him many times. And I know he's very capable to do that if he's presented any kind of possibility. He knows how to play the game. He's a real politician, though he's working kind of from the outside the system. But you never know. The system is right now it's full of strains, and it is like the old Soviet system in some respect, that it is right now too rigid and not ready to respond to a changing world and to a changing Russian society. So he has that potential. And right now, even those who have reservations have to follow him because it's right now a clear choice. Either you're for Putin and the present status quo, or you don't like the present status quo, and many don't. you have to go for Navalny because he's a clear alternative to Putin. He emerged right now, just in the last weeks or so, as a very clear alternative figure, which to a large extent changes the internal situation in Russia, at least potentially. Though, of course, no one knows for sure. These demonstrations may fade away, the people will return to their day-to-day issues. That's what the authorities hope for, that they'll clamp down and people will forget about Navalny sitting in some kind of prison somewhere in Russia.
Vladimir Golstein, do you agree that Navalny has emerged as a clear alternative to Putin? And I'm wondering, he's now in prison, but will the demonstrations continue? I mean, who picks up the mantle of his movement right now? Would it possibly be his wife?
Yeah, honestly, it's hard to say. Traditionally, when a person is, say, exiled or goes to prison, they kind of lose the momentum.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if he indeed stays in prison for like 2 years. I'm not sure, for at least for 2 years, Putin is like off the hook. But Navalny been at this game like for more than 10 years. He manages, I think as Pavel mentioned, he manages to appeal to common Russians, saying that, he's their champion. He doesn't want neither government nor all this kind of suspicious minorities take, advantage of them. But he also appeals with his program by exposing the leadership. He appeals to intelligentsia as well. So he made a bunch of statements, but, every politician, if you start digging at a certain moment, he was, for Russian policy vis-a-vis Crimea, then against it, then for it. So I'm sure one can find a lot of things. But he has a potential, so maybe he'll be like some kind of, in 2 or 3 years, he would emerge like some kind of a new leader. But I wouldn't bet on that. I have a feeling that in 2 years a lot of things will change, and I don't think that there is outside him there is some figure who would just take the mantle.
Harlan, there was an editorial in the New York Times not so long ago in which it said that Alexey Navalny is resisting Putin and he is winning. Was that perhaps hopeful thinking, or do you agree with that assessment?
I think it's nonsense. Look, Navalny does not have any kind of political constituency. That's what's necessary. Let me just use the example of Donald Trump. Trump didn't take his enemies to the court as Putin did. Trump used the issue of primarying, that is to say, if somebody disagreed with him in the Republican Party, that he would find an alternative candidate who would defeat that person, ending that person's political career. You need a constituency, you need a framework, you need a party. And unless Navalny or some other competitor is able to do that, I just don't see that that person is going to emerge unless you have some kind of, as I said, 1905 situation. Look, the issue here is that there is Putin fatigue, and at some stage, not immediately, Biden and Putin are going to have a meeting because it's in their best interest to reconcile the differences, relieve those tensions. That's not going to happen immediately, and for the time being, I think with Navalny in jail, you probably will see a decline in these protests, and it will be business as usual, which is not good for Russia. It's not good for the United States, but we have other priorities right now.
Okay, and that's where we have to end it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Arlen Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.